Before we dive into this chapter, make sure you've watched the first part of this story to fully grasp every hidden detail. You'll find the link to Chapter 1 in the description below. Now, let's continue. The party carried on as if nothing had happened, as if the air wasn't thick with secrets, silent glances, and unspoken betrayals. Laughter and conversation flowed around us, disguising the undercurrent of tension that only a few of us could feel. Across the room, Rachel was speaking to Stanley, her fingers resting lightly on his arm. She was enjoying herself, soaking in the moment, completely unaware that this was the last time she would live in a world where everything went her way. Then, her gaze met mine. For a fraction of a second, I saw it, a flicker of unease. A sense, deep in her subconscious, that something wasn't right. But just as quickly, it was gone, buried beneath her usual confident, carefree smile. She was still playing the role of the devoted wife, but to me, her eyes were empty. Once, they had been the mirror of my life, reflecting everything I had built. Now, they were nothing more than glass hiding the lies beneath. And Carmen? She stood farther back, hesitant, torn. Her gaze searched for mine, but fell away every time our eyes met. Pregnant. The word echoed in my mind, a strange combination of power and responsibility sinking into my chest. Would she be able to keep it from Stanley? And if not, how would he react? I thought through every scenario, analyzing the chessboard in my mind. Each piece had already been placed. Every move was calculated. It was only a matter of time before the game reached its final stage. The hours passed, the party winding down, but I never stopped watching Rachel and Stanley. The way they laughed together, the casual touches, the effortless deception. They still believed they were untouchable. They were wrong. I made my way to the bar, pouring myself a glass of whiskey, letting the amber liquid swirl in my glass as I felt someone step quietly behind me. Carmen. She stood close, but not too close. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Her fingers trembled at her sides, gripping the hem of her sleeve. I gave her a small nod, reassuring her. Everything was under control. How can you be so calm, Justin? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the party noise. I don't think I can pretend much longer. I took a slow sip of my drink before answering, my voice low and steady. We're close to the finale, Carmen. Just trust me. When it's over, they'll pay for every lie. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding slightly, a silent agreement. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was part of this now. By the time the guests began to leave, I shared one final glance with Rachel. She smiled, but I saw it. The shadow of wariness beneath her usual self-assurance. But suspicion? No. She still thought she had the upper hand. She had no idea. Soon, everything she and Stanley cherished would be reduced to ashes. A week passed, but the tension between us all never faded. Rachel and Stanley continued their little affair, believing they were still hidden in the shadows. But I knew them too well. Knew their habits, their arrogance. They had begun to slip. More importantly, Carmen and I had stopped being invisible. People noticed. Maybe not consciously, but enough that whispers had started. Our meetings, our lingering glances, someone would put the pieces together soon. Carmen knew it, too. That night, as we sat together in her car, parked out of sight, she was quieter than usual. She barely looked at me, her hands twisting a folded handkerchief between her fingers. I watched her, waiting. Finally, she spoke. I realized something, she said, her voice quiet but thick with something bitter. I didn't respond. I let her talk. She kept her gaze on her lap. Have you ever noticed how often Stanley disappears? Always for something important. How he comes home late, sometimes smelling like perfume that isn't mine. I stayed silent. She wasn't really asking me. She was piecing it together for herself. A long pause settled between us before she exhaled shakily. I found something, she continued, voice almost a whisper now. In his car. A hairpin. Gold, with a small emerald. Slowly, she turned to look at me. I know it's not mine. I met her gaze, unreadable. Rachel had worn a similar hairpin to the party. I didn't speak because I didn't have to. The truth was already there, hanging heavy between us. Stanley had been careful, but not careful enough. You've suspected this for a long time, haven't you? I finally said. Carmen gave a small nod. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her face, trying to hold back tears. Everything she had ignored, Every moment she had convinced herself was just nothing. It was all crashing down on her now. And I could feel it, the moment where her heartbreak hardened into something else. Something dangerous. It was never just me, was it? She murmured through her hands. I was never enough for him. I leaned in slightly, my voice low, steady. You were always more than enough, Carmen. It was him who wasn't enough. She dropped her hands, eyes red but clear now. The tears had dried. I reached for her hand, threading my fingers through hers, locking her into the moment. Stanley doesn't deserve you. And he sure as hell doesn't deserve our child. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. She wasn't lost anymore. She was awakening. And as I looked at her, seeing the last traces of doubt fade from her expression, I knew. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about taking everything Stanley had left. And I wasn't going to stop until there was nothing left of him. I always thought he was the one who would never betray me, Carmen whispered, wiping away the last traces of tears. And now it turns out he's with her. Your wife, Justin. We sat there in silence, consumed by the weight of this revelation. Carmen had no doubts left, and I felt caught between the thrill of victory and the bitter sting of disappointment. Stanley and Rachel had been digging their own graves, lying, sneaking, thinking they were untouchable. They had made this easy for me. I just had to give them a little push and let the truth consume them. Carmen, I said finally, my voice softer now. You know this isn't just about revenge anymore. You wanted the truth, but this is only the beginning. She turned to me, her eyes full of something deeper than pain, determination. No, she whispered, squeezing my hand. It's not over. This was no longer about betrayal alone. It was about watching them lose everything. Carmen's pregnancy symptoms hit her hard, relentless and unforgiving. One morning, we met in our usual secluded cafe. She looked pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her stomach. She tried to brush it off with a weak joke, but I could see it, the nausea, the exhaustion. It was getting harder to hide. She leaned in, her voice barely audible. I can't hide it anymore, she admitted, glancing around nervously. Stanley's starting to notice something's wrong. Those words sent a strange satisfaction through me. We were getting closer to the moment where Carmen would have no choice but to reveal the truth. But the timing wasn't right. You have to hold on, I told her, squeezing her hand. It'll be over soon. Then you can tell him. But not yet. She exhaled sharply, nodding, though I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. Still, she knew. We both knew. This was our secret to keep for now. But Stanley wasn't an idiot. He noticed her shifts in mood, her exhaustion, the way she flinched at certain smells, the way her hands lingered over her stomach when she thought no one was watching. And one night, as they sat together at dinner, he finally confronted her. Carmen, what's going on with you? He asked, his tone just slightly off, more suspicious than concerned. You've been different. On edge. And sick. Don't you have something to tell me? She tensed, turning away from him. Her insides churned with panic and disgust. No, she said, her voice tight. Just a little cold. Stanley didn't look convinced. Then, she struck first. Why don't you tell me, Stanley? She said coldly, pushing her plate aside. Whose hairpin did I find in your car? His expression shifted in an instant. His posture stiffened, his jaw tensed. He hesitated, too long to be innocent. Then, he forced a smile, laughing like it was ridiculous. A hairpin. He shrugged. I don't know. Maybe someone left it behind? A coworker's wife or sister? But Carmen didn't let him off the hook. Stanley, don't lie to me. Her voice was razor-sharp now. I saw the exact same hairpin on Rachel at the party. Silence. Stanley's face went blank, like a man realizing he had just stepped into a trap with no way out. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Carmen's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't back down. And that's when she made her move. She invited us, Rachel and me, to dinner for their anniversary. But we both knew this was no celebration. This was a funeral. Rachel and I drove to Stanley and Carmen's house that evening, the tension buzzing beneath the surface. Rachel was relaxed, smiling, completely unaware of what she was walking into. She loved these kinds of nights, where we all pretended to be old friends, drinking, laughing, playing the part of devoted spouses. She had no idea this would be the night her world collapsed. Stanley, too, carried himself as if everything was normal, oblivious to the destruction looming just ahead. We sat down to dinner, toasting with wine, exchanging light-hearted conversation. It all felt so perfectly ordinary. Then, Carmen made her move. She set her glass down and met each of our eyes one by one, pausing a little longer on Stanley. Then, in a quiet but deadly voice, she lifted her glass. to the truth. Rachel let out a small, awkward laugh. What truth, Carmen? Did we miss something? She asked, her voice light but slightly unsure. This was my moment. I placed my glass down, looking directly at Rachel. My voice was calm, steady. Actually, yes, I said with a small smile, which faded into something cold. You've missed a lot of things, Rachel. I let the words settle. Like the moment when I came home and found you and Stanley in our bedroom. The shift was instant. Rachel's face went white, the color draining from it. The smile she had worn so easily vanished. Stanley stiffened, his jaw tightening, his fist clenching beneath the table. They were trapped. Cornered animals with nowhere to run. Rachel tried to speak, stumbling over her words. I thought you hadn't. I cut her off. Thought I hadn't noticed? That I didn't care. My voice darkened. Rachel, I've seen enough to know exactly what our marriage means to you. Nothing. Her mouth opened, then closed. There was no excuse good enough. I turned to Stanley. And you? I exhaled, shaking my head slightly. How long did you think you could hide it? He glanced at Carmen, desperate, searching for anything, understanding, forgiveness. But he found none. Carmen's eyes burned with rage. She spoke softly but sharply. Stanley, she said, her voice trembling but strong. Just tell me one thing. She inhaled, steadying herself. The hairpin I found in your car belongs to Rachel, doesn't it? The silence was suffocating. Stanley's lips parted, but no words came out. Carmen's hands tightened into fists. You can't lie anymore. Stanley's world was crashing down, and the worst part? This was only the beginning. Stanley exhaled heavily, lowering his head as if the weight of his lies had finally settled on his shoulders. For a brief moment, he almost looked ashamed. Almost. Then, at last, he nodded. Yes, Carmen. His voice was quiet, resigned. Rachel's hairpin. I used to see her. But it was just a fling, you know? It didn't mean anything. Just a few meetings, that's all. The words hit Rachel like a slap. She turned to him, horror flooding her expression as if she had never once considered this possibility. Just meetings. Her voice trembled, but this wasn't the guilty, stammering Rachel I had expected. No, this was a woman furious at the realization that she had been nothing more than a disposable thrill. You used me, Stanley? She spat, her voice rising. Did you lie to me? Made me believe this was something real. Stanley merely shrugged, eyes flickering anywhere but at her, as if he hoped this conversation would somehow fade away if he avoided it long enough. Carmen finally stood, her presence towering over him, her eyes filled with contempt. You betrayed me, Stanley, she said, her voice unwavering. And you did it for this? A meaningless affair? That's all you have to say for yourself. Rachel collapsed into her chair, her hands covering her face. She was shaking, but I felt nothing for her anymore. There was no sympathy, no lingering attachment, only a cold satisfaction in seeing her and Stanley trapped in the mess of their own making. They had built their world on lies. And now, they were standing in the ruins. The room was suffocatingly silent, the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone. But Carmen and I weren't done yet. This was only the first blow. I turned to her, and she met my gaze. A silent agreement passed between us. She nodded slightly. It was time. I turned back to Stanley and Rachel, my voice calm, composed. I've realized something, I said. There hasn't been a future in our families for a long time. Stanley and Rachel flinched at my words, the truth finally setting in. You destroyed everything we built, I continued. But for Carmen and me, this isn't the end. It's the beginning. The beginning of something real, something you will never understand. Rachel's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but her voice caught in her throat. I didn't stop. When I saw Carmen for what she truly is, I realized I had found someone worth more than deceit. She is intelligent, beautiful, strong. My eyes locked on Stanley. She deserves better. And you? You could never give that to her. Stanley tensed, his hands clenched at his sides, but he had no words left to defend himself. You used her trust the same way you used Rachel's, I added, my voice steady. But it doesn't matter anymore. Because now, Carmen and I have a future together. Our future. At those words, Rachel visibly tensed. Her face twisted, caught between disbelief and horror, as if she was finally seeing what had been in front of her this whole time. Carmen, still watching me, gave a slight smile before speaking. Yes, she said, her voice clear. Justin and I do have a future. A future we never had with you, Stanley. Her words cut deeper than any accusation ever could. Because for a long time, she continued, there was no trust in our marriage. No real love. It all fell apart the moment you decided you could use me as if I was yours to discard. Then, in one deliberate motion, she placed her hand over her stomach. The room fell into absolute silence. Stanley and Rachel stared at her, motionless. They already knew what was coming next, but their minds refused to accept it. "Justin and I are having a child," Carmen said, her voice steady, her eyes locked onto Stanley. "A child that is the product of love, not deception. We're not hiding it." She straightened. "We're not ashamed of it." Stanley paled, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. There was none. Rachel clutched her hands to her chest, her face glistening with tears. But they weren't tears of heartbreak. They were tears of realization. Loss. Defeat. How could you?" Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. Her gaze met mine, but there was no anger, just raw, painful confusion. I thought there was something real between us." I let out a short, cold laugh. "Real?" I echoed. "Is that all you have to say? You betrayed me without a second thought. You never once stopped to think about what you were losing." I leaned forward slightly, voice lower. "And now you want to talk about real?" Rachel flinched at my tone, but I didn't care. "You destroyed that illusion when you let Stanley into your life," I continued. "So don't stand here and ask for loyalty when you threw it away a long time ago." Stanley finally found his voice, but it was weak, desperate. "Carmen, you can't do this," he pleaded. "I never meant to lose you. It was just a fling. It meant nothing." Carmen let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Nothing," she repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "So I meant nothing to you either, right? As long as you were having fun, it didn't matter how I felt. But now, it's real to me. You were the one who ruined everything." She inhaled sharply, eyes dark with finality. "But, Stanley, I'm glad I know the truth now. I'm glad I know who you really are." And just like that, it was over. We stood before them without regret, without pity. They had written their own endings. We were simply here to deliver it. This was their downfall, and our beginning. After that night, everything fell apart. Rachel and Stanley's world, so carefully constructed, so tightly held together by lies, began to crumble. Rumors spread. Friends noticed the distance between them. Carmen stopped coming home some nights. Rachel stopped wearing her wedding ring. Stanley and Rachel? They were both alone. As for us, Carmen and I had already moved forward. Together. Because while they stood in the ruins of their betrayal, we had built something real. And that was the ultimate revenge. The weight of their choices settled on them like an unbearable burden. I could see it in their eyes. The pain, the regret, the realization that there was no undoing what had been done. But that was their burden to carry, their mistake to live with. Carmen and I had no reason to linger in the past. Our paths had parted completely, and there was no room left for pity, no lingering desire to make things right. This was the price of their betrayal. And we were ready to move forward. The end of one life, the beginning of another. The divorce process was long, grueling, but neither of us wavered. Carmen and I walked into it fully prepared, knowing that once we emerged on the other side, there would be nothing left binding us to Rachel and Stanley. Every time I saw them in court, I saw what they had become. Rachel was a shell of the woman I had once known. The confident, lively woman who had once been my wife was now gaunt, tired, her eyes hollowed by the weight of her own betrayal. She had lost something she could never get back, and she knew it. Stanley, on the other hand, was simply resigned. There was no fight in him anymore. He had accepted his loss, though the realization of what he had truly destroyed had left an unmistakable emptiness on his face. In the end, the division was simple. Fair. We took what we needed. No more, no less. I handed Rachel the keys to our house, the home she had once cherished. Now, it was just a place filled with ghosts of her own making. Carmen did the same, leaving Stanley in the house they had built together, surrounded by nothing but memories of what he had ruined. With our share, Carmen and I bought a small but beautiful home on the outskirts of town. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't excessive, but it was ours. A place untouched by the shadows of the past. Each room was filled with warmth and love, a home that we built together. We carefully picked out the furniture, considering every detail. Every color, every fabric, every piece was chosen to reflect us. It became our sanctuary. Carmen had never looked more radiant. There was a peace in her eyes that I had longed to see, a happiness untainted by doubt or betrayal. We spent long evenings on our terrace, talking about our future, dreaming about the child we were bringing into this world. This was real. This was ours. Rachel and Stanley. They were left with nothing but the consequences of their choices. Rachel tried to move forward, but every step was weighed down by regret. She withdrew from her social circles, becoming a shadow of herself. Even among old friends, she felt like an outsider, her reputation now defined by the affair that had cost her everything. Stanley buried himself in work, but even that couldn't fill the void. The confidence, the ambition he had once carried so proudly, it was gone. Without Carmen, his life was empty, colorless. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. Carmen and I thrived. We filled our home with laughter, love, and anticipation for our daughter, for the life we were building together. To celebrate, we held a gender reveal party, surrounded by close friends. The house was decorated with balloons, soft glowing lights, and an air of pure joy. Everyone held their breath as Carmen and I cut into the cake, revealing the soft pink filling inside. A girl. We were having a daughter. The room erupted in cheers, and as I looked at Carmen, her eyes bright with tears of happiness, I knew. This was what I had been waiting for my entire life. We poured our hearts into preparing for her arrival. I painted the walls of her nursery a warm pastel pink. Carmen carefully chose the furniture, delicate white cribs, soft blankets, little stuffed animals that would soon become her first friends. Every night, we would stand in her room, imagining the sound of her laughter filling the space. And then, finally, the day came. The day our lives changed forever. The moment Carmen gave birth to our daughter, I knew. This was the purest form of love I had ever felt. I waited for her at the birthing center, my hands shaking as I clutched the flowers and the small golden pendant I had picked out. When she finally emerged, cradling our baby girl in her arms, I stepped forward and placed the necklace in her hand. "This," I said softly, "is for giving me a true miracle. You are the most beautiful mother, and now we have our little princess." Carmen smiled through her tears, and together we carried our daughter home. Her first home. A home filled with nothing but love. One afternoon, as we walked through the park, enjoying the warmth of spring, we saw her. Rachel. She spotted us from a distance, hesitating at first, as if unsure whether she should approach. But after a moment, she took a few steps forward and stopped in front of us. Her eyes softened as she looked at the baby in the stroller. "I see you're happy," she said quietly, her voice filled with a sadness I hadn't heard before. "Justin, I'm so sorry for what I did." She lowered her gaze. "Cheating was the biggest mistake of my life. I lost the one man who truly loved me." Carmen and I exchanged a glance. We felt nothing. No anger. No resentment. Only the quiet understanding that some things can never be undone. "Thank you, Rachel," Carmen said softly. "And thank you for your wishes. Justin and I are truly happy, and we'll cherish this forever." Rachel nodded, her eyes shimmering with unspoken words. But she didn't say anything else. She simply turned and walked away. The future is ours. As I watched her disappear down the path, I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel loss. I simply felt at peace. I looked at Carmen. She smiled at me. The smile of a woman who had left the past behind, who had embraced a future that was ours and ours alone. I reached for her hand, and together, we continued down the path, our daughter nestled safely between us. Because at long last, we had everything we had ever wanted, and nothing could take that away. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe to the channel.